Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art and culture. And so, this week, it felt deceptively easier and harder to assemble. The albums were actually easier for me to digest, but I felt like I had less time. Most thanks to my full stream work ahead on the best hit songs of the 2010s. Stay tuned, the development cycle on that one has been something, let me just say that. It's gonna be a big video. But in the meantime, even as it seems like everything has slowed down, except my workload, let's stay on the pulse. So alright, got 8 albums on the docket this week, but let's start off with something older from Envy, The Fallen Crimson. 一人を感じ届き破って得た清らかさを Okay, cue the usual preamble about how this isn't usually my genre, I don't have the deepest level of insight, I'm also really late to the punch on this. And normally the follow-up to all that is me saying that it's just not my thing, but Envy surprised me in a really big way. This is a Japanese post-hardcore and screamo band that started in the late 90s, but really broke out with the excellent All the Footprints You've Ever Left in the Fear of Expecting Ahead in 2001. And from there, they get a pretty damn strong back catalog, able to balance out some huge visceral moments against more sensitive and melodic cuts, especially on 2006's Insomniac Doze and 2015's Atheist Cornea. Now, this project is coming after a few very turbulent years. Their long-running guitarist and drummer both left and were replaced, and even their frontman took a hiatus for a couple of years, but now we got a new album, and I'll admit I've wavered on this a fair bit. On the one hand, Envy is embracing more vibrant and distinctive melodies, integrating even some female vocals with a few well-placed key changes, and even leaning into the post-rock side with some of the blurry background guitar textures, and it can be really damn pretty. But on the flip side, man, I wish the bass lines could match some of the more complexity in the new drum work, or at least have some more consistent driving presence in the mix, at least to shore up our frontman whose scream vocals can sound uncomfortably shredded at points, and that's not counting the weird watery passages where it just sounds buried in effects. Then we got the content. Full disclaimer, I don't speak Japanese, and I'm working off of printed liner notes in English that don't seem like an exact translation, which the band has described this album as being more about death, but it's also about how the human spirit seems to confront death's inevitability, especially within power structures that only function based upon denial of death and the lingering existential crises that come in showing any sort of emotion around the possible inevitability of it. It's mostly impressionistic writing, it can hit for some stunning moments of poetry, but for as visceral as certain parts are, not knowing Japanese means that certain lyrical moments of transcendence are kinda hazy when placed alongside the melodies, which, I'll admit it, it's a factor why I struggle with music and songwriting that's in different languages that I don't understand. But still, this is still really damn good, and the best moments, they will hit that sort of transcendence regardless. Again, some of the production here is beautiful, so yeah, strong 7 out of 10. If you haven't caught it as a fan of these genres, make sure you do. Really good stuff. Next up from 7 Spires, Emerald Seas. Okay, look, I know when I've reviewed symphonic metal before, I have been harsh, or in reality, I'm just consistent and a lot of metalheads don't want to admit they're just as thin-skinned as fans of other genres, but it's also become a bad cliche with acts in this subgenre that become more about propping up a potent lead singer rather than refining the production or the lyricism or even the compositions in general. And this was sadly absolutely an issue for 7 Spires in their 2017 debut, Solveig. Yes, Adrienne Cowan has a lot of range, even if I think her growling leaves a lot to be desired, but the grooves were so badly mixed, and alongside some pretty weak compositions on an overlong album, I was left thinking this band was a real mess. Now, thankfully, Emerald Seas cleans this production up a fair bit, even though I will not call it great, and the tinnier mid-range around the acoustic guitar and the solos mean they slide in with an audible thud with inadequate bass lines. But I gotta be honest, this band still has a lot of issues, and Cowan might be part of the problem. Yeah, she's got a ton of firepower, but she's also very pitchy, and she's got a tendency to oversing, which doesn't really help sell dramatic presence and a more emotional arc here. On top of that, the compositions remain very middle of the road. I've said this in the past, symphonic metal, especially flirting with power metal like this is, the worst thing it can be is boring, and the lack of distinctive dynamics or more interesting hooks, along with limited transitions, really hurts this album. But that's the other odd problem. In absence of stronger choruses or a sense of conventional structure in the songs, they often awkwardly blend their lyrical cadence to excuse some flubbed rhymes as if they're telling a bigger story, which they actually are, as this is a concept album designed as a prequel to Solveig, which is also a concept album, telling a story of a doomed man before he transforms into a demon to rule the underworld and find eternal life, but potentially at the cost of his love. And maybe it's just me thinking that it's a mistake to hammer out two underthought concept albums when you haven't mastered writing a memorable hook, but at least when Camelot made Epica in 2003, of which this strongly resembles, there were some deeper themes of what humanity will sacrifice in damnation for knowledge or sublime experiences, and also instrumentation and writing that can credibly sell the shift in tone, with undercooked motivations and little unique variation in the atmosphere to flesh out the tragedy of the story. I'm just not nearly as intrigued, even if I do think this album ends pretty strongly with the Trouble with Eternal Life and the instrumental title track. Alright, look, I want to be nice to this. It is an improvement, they're on the right track, but not by enough. Not yet. Strong 5 out of 10, only if you're curious. Next up, from Nicolas Jaar, Cenizas. Is anyone else kind of shocked that we're getting a new Nicolas Jaar project already? We already got a pretty strong Against All Logic album a couple months back, now we're getting an ambient project too? Of course, I'm not about to complain. I might have only been lukewarm on Sirens in 2016, but Space's Only Noise is a marvelous little electronic album from 2011 that takes a decidedly European approach to its organic futurism, and it's such a unique texture that it's easy for me to recommend. This, to put it mildly, it's a lot tougher to decode, mostly because even by the extent of the eerily prophetic side of Sirens and the increasingly dark and alien side of the last Against All Logic album, this is murky as all hell, where Jaar reportedly put himself in isolation to decompress and strip away negativity amidst a fracturing world, and then realized the only way to get there was just barreling through it. And that can lead to a pretty tough ambient listen, where the fractured tones and darkness will occasionally stabilize into a funeral dirge with gothic swell, the beats submerged in lo-fi crackles and barely understandable voices, with the occasional plucks and padded strings barely stabilizing before they fracture or fall apart like the sound of crumbling rocks, with instability and anxiety coming through most whenever the horns will just discordantly keen. This is an album that's designed to both brood and feel intensely uncomfortable while doing so, and does so really well. Maybe even too well in spots, where there are a few extremely high tinny frequencies that got left in, along with a few blown out textures, and they get distracting. But more so, I think that Nicolas Jaar might just have been the victim of terrible timing yet again. It's a potent listen, but in the middle of a pandemic, it became the last thing I wanted to hear this week, especially as for as long and dark as it is, it feels like there's no real catharsis offered by the end. A project that wants to look around, but not ahead, given how it seems like everything might seem downhill from this peak, which isn't really a call to action so much as the bleakest possible observation, no matter how many people want to recontextualize it as such. I mean, like Sirens, I do expect this will play better in a few months removed when there's a little bit more distance from the state, but as of now, light 7 out of 10, but just warning you, will not be for everyone. Next up, from Patricia Taxxon, Rainbow Road. It's been a minute since I've talked about a Patricia Taxxon album, this one going in a direction of brighter synthwave in a similar vein as Traveler, primarily instrumental with a lot of gleaming, interweaving melody lines and slightly more textured percussion. And it absolutely feels like a melodic expansion and refinement of some of those core sounds from that album. And as such, it's probably the most I've enjoyed a Patricia Taxxon album since Punk. Now, I'm not gonna call it her best. I'd argue there are songs that can run long and can feel a little fragmented in their ideas when the melodies just do not stick stick as tightly, and it's hard to avoid the feeling that a few of the beats can feel punchier than the tunes they're supporting, which can lead to a few songs just sounding a little bit off balance. But if we're looking at an electronic project that's got all the gleaming, spacey color of soaring on a tangled spectrum of light, where any moment can leave you both breathless and a little frustrated, yeah, Taxxon delivers. And while I think it's a shade away from greatness that she's touched before, it's still really damn good, especially given its terrific starting songs and that beautiful closing cut that features some truly excellent subtle melodic interplay. In other words, extremely strong 7 out of 10, definitely worth your time. Check this out. Next up, from Ingrid Andress, Ladylike.
Girl at the bar, the same place where this all got started.
This was only a matter of time, until more mainstream labels started to hear the more lush orchestration of indie acts like Caitlin Smith or Mike and the Moonpies and said, wait a minute, we got budgets, we can afford to do this a lot more easily. Which, if you know Ingrid Andress's breakthrough single, More Hearts Than Mine, that assessment might sound a little weird, but it's definitely the feel to a short but pretty expensive sounding debut album. And as such, it's pretty good. I wouldn't quite say Andress is a powerful or entirely unique vocalist, but she straddles the line between pop and country, honestly a little bit better than Kelsey Ballerini did last week, even if she also slides towards reverb, oversaturation, and some clunkier percussion. I do find it kind of ironic how she ends the album with the title track on how she's not particularly ladylike on a project with some of the most lush, classic pop-leaning, borderline feminine-coded instrumentals we've heard in mainstream country in years. Following off a song called Life at the Party, which shares the same title and thematic ideas as a Jake Owen song from 2013 that frankly does it a lot better, but Andress does have a stretch of a couple really good songs here. She's got a knack for emotional nuance that shines through the desperate attempt to recapture the relationship magic on Stranger, or the stumbles back into the hookup on Anything But Love, the lingering implication of meeting the family that means a lot more but could really fall short on More Hearts Than Mine, or even the ask for clarity on We're Not Friends, and both, they're well framed. That being said, this is a project that could have afforded to lean into its countryside in terms of songwriting detail and flair, but it's also only 8 songs in less than a half hour. It goes down well, but a little bit more meat to flesh out the picture, it would have been welcome. As it is, I definitely see a ton of potential. I do like this, but I'm not quite convinced I love it outside of a few moments, so extremely strong 7 out of 10. Want to hear more? I think there's greatness, at least a possibility. Next up, from 5 Seconds of Summer, Calm. Honest question, who even cares at this point? Because I'm on the record of saying that 5 Seconds of Summer, they were far better off in the explosive pop-punk of their self-titled album and Sounds Good Feels Good than a pivot into the increasingly anonymous and badly produced pop. Even with Youngblood, it led to some scattered success. But it doesn't look like Calm was even doing that, as the cruddy studio version of Easier has really underperformed on the charts. Instead, look, I'm not going to go on the ledge of saying that they're turning 5 Seconds of Summer into Maroon 5. 5 Sauce is a little bit burlier, they can carry a thicker guitar timbre, they don't want to hand in their rock credentials that quickly. But between the obviously programmed percussion borrowing from trap and every vocal filter tacked onto an increasingly painful falsetto, this is a band that's getting run through a garbled version of that Maroon 5 filter, where compositions that might have potential, they're just turned into murky, anonymous mainstream gunk. The band is claimed to be inspired by industrial music to find more groove, but even if I believe that consistently outside of Teeth, it's the really shoddy late 80s industrial sounds that have no edge or atmosphere or even texture, especially when it's easier to point at the production credits from Louis Bell and Andrew Watt and say more ideas were pulled from Post Malone than Nine Inch Nails. Hell, they got the Edge from U2 on guitar for a song, and they couldn't even make strong use of him behind all the tacked on effects. Now, I think the larger problem is that 4 albums in, 5 Seconds of Summer don't really have a unique identity or tone to call their own. At least not on the albums, because apparently live they bring a real edge, which makes me question why their label wants them to sound as anonymous and inoffensive as possible. Now, this would be where I would run to the writing and hope to God they'd have something or some strong standout hooks. It's kind of half measure here. A few of the hooks are salvageable, mostly when they stack the leads or pick up a slightly more distinctive tone, like the acoustic touches on Red Desert Bastard or Lonely Heart, or the extended cocaine references that is Thin White Lies. It was kind of hilarious. But then we get the band's attempt at more swaggering attitude with a few touches of self-aggrandizing ego, and maybe it's just a combination of limited personality in the writing and delivery that doesn't really carry a lot of gravitas. But the preening feels thin, and the content just does not have enough in terms of dynamics or flair for me to stand out. And at this point, that might as well be the story of the band. 5 out of 10. Can't really recommend it. Next up, from Pearl Jam, Gigaton.
Leaves a lot to ignore when the past is the present and the future's no more.
It's been 7 years since the last Pearl Jam album, which is kind of staggering to me because Lightning Bolt was genuinely great, but it was also probably Pearl Jam's leanest and most conventionally structured and sounding album in years. So if you're taking this long in between projects, especially with the singles that rolled out, had a slightly stranger, off-kilter tone and structure, we could be getting something completely off the walls. I remember Pearl Jam's mid to late 90s run, they are capable of that. And as thus, with Gigaton, well, okay, while I really like Lightning Bolt, it's absolutely an album that showed Pearl Jam resting on their laurels. They've been writing themselves into rock history for decades. I didn't really mind the comfortable victory lap, even though that's what it was. Now, Gigaton to some extent is also doing that, but not only is it significantly less fun, it's got this weirdly stiff, pompous vibe that doesn't fit well with the experimentation, but also sadly has felt very common among a certain stripe of long-running rock bands. Think latter period U2, or maybe even recent Manic Street Preachers in spots, making a lot of broad and sweeping statements that feel overwritten and portentous, but don't coalesce or feel remotely consistent. They're just half measures, and when you have Pearl Jam's problem of running out of gas by the final third of the album, you're left with a much more frustrating and underwhelming listen than you might want. It doesn't help matters that a reprioritization on groove over guitar crunch and driving melody has left Mike McCready and Stone Gossard trying to punch out of a lot of sloppy mixing. New producer Josh Evans might have some long-running connections with the band, but between that and the messy synth keyboard blending and that awful horn pickup on Buckle Up, I'm sorry, he sounds way over his head, especially compared to how well Brendan O'Brien managed everything as the previous producer. Then we got the content. I mean, I do like what seems to be the central idea, which is desperately clinging to human connection, or even just trying to find internal peace and security in a world that's spiraling out of control with human fallibility still in play. Gee, wonder how many themes we're getting that in 2020. But it's also kind of ironic, given how overwritten and occasionally obtuse this album can feel, which doesn't help any sense of populism in describing communication in the political content. And there are absolutely some really good poetic moments, but for a project that's opening up with the assertion that there's so much more to be said, it's frustrating how little of it cuts deeper, which feels like a strange step back where this band, they've got nothing left to lose, especially at this point in their career. Look, again, this is not bad. I do think Pearl Jam has made worse albums than this, but it's a lesser entry. It's a far cry from the greatness we would know. Just for the fans at this point, 6 out of 10. Maybe if you're curious. And finally, from Dua Lipa, Future Nostalgia. It feels weird for me to say that I was slightly ahead of the pack when it came to Dua Lipa, especially when the whole world seems to have gotten on board to hype Future Nostalgia as a true moment that puts her on the A-list. Now granted, while I liked that self-titled album a lot, I was also very conscious of its shortcomings. The production was inconsistent, I was hoping for a little more lyrical detail, those added elements that would really help flesh out her unique personality, as she did tend to wear her influences on her sleeve pretty strongly, and which I'll admit had me questioning a move to embrace more of a full 80s pastiche, as was implied by some of the singles, but this isn't quite that. Hell, the title track features a pseudo-rap delivery that isn't far removed from early Kesha, and Good in Bed is basically a mid-2000s Lily Allen song. Not a compliment, by the way. But that's the odd thing about Future Nostalgia, is trying to convert the reference of Dua Lipa's obvious influence into more, in order to force that comparison and draw strength by association. And I'm not always sure that's a benefit. Lady Gaga did it too in 2010-2011 with all the Madonna references, and I'd argue that didn't exactly age well. That's one reason why Future Nostalgia feels like a bit of a lateral move for Dua Lipa as a pop album, because it only really hits transcendence when it amplifies the best of that parallel source material, which is why Physical might be on par or even better than Olivia Newton-John's version, and Love Again takes its Gaga-esque pop nerd side to vamp magnificently off that Whitetown sample. That being said, there is a part of me that wishes Dua Lipa would give her melodies as much development as the fat bass lines. There's a well-balanced breeziness to the best songs and the best grooves from that self-titled album that the slightly faded and paradoxically kind of overmixed disco focus here doesn't allow to the same way. And while we're in that territory, I can't really say the writing took the step up for which I was hoping. I don't mind the songs about falling in love hard, knowing the likelihood of it all blowing up in her face, because Dua Lipa can sell frustrated dread and forceful exuberance well, but it starts feeling a little one note until the final two songs, where the sex is the only thing holding it together on Good in Bed, and that feminist call to change that is Boys Will Be Boys. Which, yes, it's obvious. It's intentionally designed to be provocative in its language. It's pissed off the people for which you would expect. But not only does it switch things up kind of nicely by the end of the album, it's a welcome bit of hard context to the inherent risk of her loving this hard, especially when she now has a platform and people listening. The kids aren't all right, especially by the messages that are being passed down. She wants to correct the narrative. I can't blame her. But overall, really good pop album, but again, a bit of a lateral move. And while I'm convinced Dua Lipa has a great pop album in her, outside of certain moments, I'm not sure this is it. I'm happy it's gonna do well though, and you know what, so very strong 7 out of 10. Absolutely worth hearing. Make sure to take time, check this out. A lot of fun. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. And I understand this particular time, if you don't want to contribute to my Patreon, I completely understand. This is going to be tough times for what looks like to be a couple of months ahead. So, hey, if you guys want to pull back from that, I have to stress this again, I completely get it. But hey, if you want to help contribute to the schedule, links right over there. And as I'm sure some of you had some opinions about what I said in here, link to the comments right down there. Have fun. Until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.